All healthy human eyes perceive and interpret motion at a specific rate. This motion, however, is not bound by a frame rate, and it would be improper to describe the human eye as a sort of camera which can perceive motion in terms of 30 or 60 FPS. That's just not how our eyes work. Rather, our eyes constantly perceive object motion as it happens, which is why objects moving at very high velocities don't appear choppy. What our brain does do, however, is incorporate a great deal of motion blur into the moving image. Motion blur is the effect that results from an object being in motion during the time at which a single exposure takes place. But hold on, Greg, you just used the word exposure. Exposure is a photography term, so why are we using that word to describe our eyes if our eyes are not cameras? It's a tricky subject to explain. Michael Stevens from Vsauce already explained this in one of his videos, so I'll go ahead and let him take it from here.
Very good question. What frame rate do we see the world in with our eyeballs? I mean, how fast does information travel from our eye to our brain? Now here's what we do know. The visual cortex in our brain usually holds that information from our retina for about a 15th of a second. So if an animation moves at 15 frames a second or faster, it's going to look nice and fluid. But if it's lower than 15 frames a second, our brain's not fooled by the beta movement and it'll look like it's skipping.
So basically, the faster the frame rate, the better everything's going to look in the end.
Something definitely worth noting is the fact that continuous motion, as displayed via the mediums of TVs and monitors at around 100 frames per second and above, are typically more difficult to discern from one another than their lower frame rate counterparts. Another clear truth in this matter is the fact that as the frame rate of any video increases, the ability for the human eye to distinguish individual frames diminishes drastically past around 100 Hz, and yes, while the well-trained eye can easily spot the difference between 120 and 144 Hz, it can more easily distinguish, say, 30 Hz from 60. This indicates a law of diminishing returns when it comes to monitor frame rates and the rates at which chemical reactions take place within the occipital lobe of the human brain. It's also easier to see singular, non-continuous, abrupt changes in individual images. Let me show you what I mean by that. Stare at this black screen and make a mental note of what color you see when it pops up in the center. Got it? Now make a note of this color. Did you see both? The colors you should have seen were red and green. If you saw both, congratulations, your eye was able to perceive individual images as they appeared for only 1/60th of a second on a black screen. So there, we have finite proof that the human eye can at least distinguish 60 individual frames per second, right? Well, let's try another experiment. Tell me what color you see now. Did you see it? Was the color yellow? Congratulations, you were incorrect. The colors you should have seen were again red and green in that order, and each appeared again for only 1/60th of 1 second. So what's going on here? Didn't we just confirm that the human eye could distinguish individual frames that exist for only 17 milliseconds? Well, yes, but only under the condition that the frame change was abrupt and non-continuous. You see, when you're playing a video game on a monitor with a refresh rate of 144 Hz, and assuming a full 144 frames are being sent to the monitor per second, you are actually seeing and perceiving a full 144 frames per second. There is no denying that. However, when the changes between each individual frame are subtle, for instance when your character is walking around in an open world or when you're panning over an entire city, those individual frames are less easily perceived. In the case of fast-moving high-intensity scenarios, as in the case of CSGO, those individual frames are crucial because viewpoints and character movements are constantly changing and at fast paces. It's why the individual flashes of both red and green were very easy to perceive, but also why the quick transition from red to green resulted in a mix or blend of both colors, resulting in the yellow. This is indicative of those fast view changes, quick pivots, and sharp character movements in CSGO and other first-person shooters in particular, which is why higher refresh rates are generally more desirable in those kinds of games. In the latter scenario, both the shape and duration of each color shown was identical, so the abrupt change resulted in a blend and thus a lower perceived frame rate, 30 FPS versus 60. The United States Air Force also conducted a response time test on their pilots. What they did was have their pilots stare at a blank screen and then momentarily flash an image of a plane onto the screen. They found that some of their pilots could identify even the make and model of the plane shown, even though it was only shown for 1/220th of a second. Now, while this test does prove that the human eye can distinguish individual frames at rates much higher than 60 Hz, it does not indicate how many successful frames the pilots could see back to back. So for example, if the plane was shown moving across the screen entirely in 1 second at a frame rate of 220 frames per second, the pilot wouldn't be able to perceive and translate every single frame. It's simply too much information for the brain to process. In fact, the moving image of the plane would likely give the pilot a headache, as Michael Stevens explains.
Here's the thing. If frame rates get higher and higher, you wind up with an image that can actually cause headaches when people watch it on a screen. So back to the point about our eyes tracking onto objects. If I do this, move my hand in front of my face and track it with my eyes, I can see my hand, it makes sense. But at a certain point, my hand will move so fast that it's just a blur. And the reason it's a blur is because my eye can only track so fast. And when objects move faster than our eyeballs can track, your brain adds in motion blur. That way we get a sense of movement happening, but we don't see something like a hand randomly appearing all over the place.
So it's literally too much visual information for our brains to transpose without incorporating motion blur, which is our brain's way of relieving visual stress. Racing games in particular are notorious for incorporating artificial motion blur for this very reason. When enjoying a racing game at say 100 frames per second, the car in the center of your screen, your car, remains rather stationary with the exception of a few turns, slides, and hills. Everything else, however, moves at a very, very fast pace, especially near the edges of your screen. If these moving images were shown without motion blur, you'd likely develop an intense headache with time, especially if you're not used to such quick movements. This would occur because you're forcing your brain to convert 100 stills, essentially, into a conscious, moving picture, whereas in the real world your brain would most certainly resort to motion blur to alleviate the potential stress involved with the visual translation. I'll end this video with one final trivial notion. We've already concluded that the human eye is not a camera and therefore cannot be measured in terms of frame rates or even pixels. However, the next time you're riding shotgun with a buddy on a highway, have a glance at a passing car's rims. Individual spokes rotating hundreds of times per second eventually become all jumbled up by our brain, resulting in the illusion of no wheel spin whatsoever. It's difficult to see at times, and the car in question has to be moving at a certain speed, but when the conditions are right, it will appear as though the car is simply gliding over the road without its tires rotating at all. We can mimic this exact phenomena via a camera by timing exposure specifically to when the next spoke of each rim or the next blade of each rotor moves into the same position that the previous spoke or blade was the frame before. So if cameras see it this way and the human eye sees it this way, can we still say that the human eye's perception of reality is entirely separate from that of a camera's? Food for thought.
This isn't real. What is real? How do you define real? If you're talking about what you can feel, what you can smell, what you can taste and see, then real is simply electrical signals interpreted by your brain.
So the next time you find yourself shopping for a computer monitor, ask yourself the following question: what kind of games will I play? If your number one answer was first-person shooters, opt for the monitor with the highest refresh rate possible, and be sure to pair it with a graphics card that's beefy enough to output that many frames per second. If that's a little confusing, check out the card above me. Other than that, be sure to give the video a thumbs up if you like the content, give it a thumbs down if you hate everything about life, click the subscribe button if you haven't already, and stay tuned for more tech-related content here on the channel. This is Science Studio. Thanks for learning with us.